Over to you, Scott. Welcome.
Thanks, Martin, for that generous introduction. So it's great to be here presenting at the IAS, which has generated so much of the influential work that has guided this project. So today what I'm going to be talking about is a series of two papers, primarily that were recently published in Sociological Methodology. And these papers are focusing on micro-macro relationships in social networks. And specifically what we mean by micro-macro relationships is that something at the relational level, some relational selection process, is creating unique network structures. So rather than generating a network as a whole or predicting the probability of a specific tie, looking at first the relationships or the selection mechanisms that are generating some characteristic of the network, such as the degree distribution, the level of betweenness, centrality, centralization, segregation. And then second, trying to actually integrate this micro-macro thinking into a mediation framework, where what we're able to do is estimate the effect of some relational mechanism or network selection mechanism on the individuals and groups nested in social networks, because that selection mechanism is changing network structures. And so before I jump into this, what I want to do is actually motivate the micro-macro framework by situating it in some of the empirical research and research problems that I've encountered in the past that kind of motivated me to start thinking about some of these problems. So when I started grad school almost 10 years ago now, which sounds frightening, I got involved in a research project with my former advisor and current collaborator, Dana Haney. And what we were working on was examining illegal drug trafficking happening on the dark web. And essentially what the dark web is an encrypted area of the internet where individuals can download anonymizing software and select into illegal markets. Now, the markets themselves essentially look more or less like the standard markets that you've probably encountered online in the past, such as Amazon or eBay, where distributors are listing various products for distribution. They list ratings that are, prices that are typically listed in Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency, and have kind of this collated information on prior sales. And so the only real difference that we encounter on these online markets compared to conventional online markets is that the products that actually are being distributed are highly controlled. So things like crack cocaine, heroin, opium, oxycodone. I have a list of listings over here to give you some illustration of what that actually looks like. And so what we were trying to figure out was what we viewed as a twofold policy problem that is especially pronounced in Western nations, but particularly in the US. And what that is since the year 2000, rates of drug overdose have just accelerated, and comorbidities associated with substance abuse have also accelerated as well, to the point where the number of people who died from opioid overdose between 2000 and 2015 increased about 4 times over. So on one hand, we have this opioid epidemic that is devastating communities, especially white affluent communities that actually have the money to purchase from online venues. But on the other hand, what we also have is this history of supply-side policing that has created an insane amount of social harm by its essentially doling out excessive punishments and contributing to a bloated criminal justice system in the United States. And so what we were trying to grapple with is how can we address these online markets, which are allowing purchasers to buy drugs at a higher rate than they have in the past, buy more potent drugs than they've been able to get access to in the past, do so in a relatively discreet way that insulates them from exposure to police, while also not promoting supply-side policies that are going to contribute to an even more bloated prison system. And so to do this, what we did was we applied for an NSF grant, and we got money to essentially scrape some major dark web markets. So we used histories of sales to recreate bipartite transaction networks, where each relationship we were observing was an illegal drug exchange between a buyer and a vendor. So we have kind of an aggregated snapshot of one of the markets we scraped here on the right-hand side, mapped to a grid layout, where the squares are representing vendors. The black nodes are most of the little dots you see there representing buyers. Node size is proportional to the amount of drug exchange a particular node has engaged in. And the shaded region, especially at the bottom, is essentially illustrating an area of the network where a ton of market activity has occurred. So this is a region of the market where buyers and sellers are purchasing from each other at an extremely high rate. And so what we were seeing in this network is that essentially there's a high level of consolidation around a handful of highly active buyers and a handful of highly active distributors who are engaging in the highest proportion of drug trafficking. creating a relatively heavy-tailed degree distribution and a high amount of clustering within the network as a whole. So based on some of our pilot studies on the darknet, what we consistently found was that this high level of clustering and this heavy-tailed degree distribution was essentially being generated by what we called a trust premium. And so what this refers to is if we think of classic theories of markets in kind of institutional economics and economic sociology, we know market exchange carries some amount of risk. And one of the ways that actors in markets overcome this risk in legal exchange settings is by enforcement from the state. And so governments can assure property rights, they can enforce contracts, they can guarantee that the rules of exchange are essentially assured. The problem we encounter in online illegal trade is essentially twofold. So on one hand, the online medium creates a high level of information asymmetry. People aren't actually able to inspect goods prior to purchasing. And as a result, they're not able to guarantee that, for instance, if I'm buying heroin, I'm being sold heroin and not fentanyl. And so I might not be able to dose properly. So it increases the risk additionally because not only am I unable to inspect goods, but product contamination isn't simply an issue of a product breaking. It could actually pose a health risk. The second reason is that because the legal forum is itself essentially not only not protected by the state, but the subject of state power, what it means is that market actors are incurring an additional risk because they are unable or they need to subvert state surveillance, but they're also unable to trust exchange partners because the risk of scamming is heightened as well. And so the riskiness of the trade setting essentially creates this trust premium where buyers and sellers are willing to pay higher prices and disproportionately select two established sellers. So based on this idea that trust is essentially driving connection in online drug markets or purchasing in online drug markets, what we've been advocating for over a series of about 5 papers is what we call trust-based policing. And the idea here is that rather than trying to focus on identifying key actors and arresting them, what we can do instead is take advantage of the fact that all trust building on online forums is actually being established through the platforms themselves. And so law enforcement can go into online markets and attempt to reduce trust through through distinct formal and informal mechanisms. So informally, one way that market actors gain entrance into darknet markets is essentially by going on online message boards that are similar to places like Reddit, but they are hosted on the darknet. And so we call this kind of trolling the darknet, where buyers or where law enforcement can actually go on these online message boards, essentially slander established distributors or new distributors, say that they've been ripped off, saying that the product is not good, saying it's not worth it, they were unprofessional, that they didn't do something efficiently, and it caused the buyer to be in kind of the subject of law enforcement in an effort to actually reduce this kind of trust premium. The second mechanism is to specifically actually go onto the online markets themselves and make small-scale purchases in order to leave negative sales reviews. And so just like on eBay, you actually have like a -5 to 5-star rating that you observe in an online illegal market. And law enforcement can potentially go in there, make a small purchase, and leave a -5 rating, say got ripped off, say something didn't arrive as promised. And specifically, the way we're thinking about trust-based policing is as something that is going to be most effective when targeted towards new buyers and new markets. Because there's this critical period when new sellers are first entering a market and when markets are first being established where there isn't kind of a critical mass of reputational information previously built up in order to attract new purchasers. And so targeting these kind of early stage markets and early stage sellers and pushing down their reputational information could be a way to essentially slow the growth of online markets and prevent new markets from emerging. So we attempted to test some of these ideas using our data in an empirically grounded agent-based simulation where we actually implemented various levels of trust-based policing and evaluated how the network responded after these interventions. And so what we were doing here was using an empirically grounded stochastic actor-oriented model where we first fit a stochastic actor-oriented model to our longitudinal transaction data, and then use that model to initiate simulations based on distinct levels of intervention to reputational information and trust on the market. And what this plot on the left-hand side here is showing is that we start seeing modest reductions in sales volume once we increase the level of reputational information reduction. And so if we reduce reputations by about 20%, we see about a 10% reduction in the overall number of sales volume, which is a pretty modest reduction. But we think it's actually quite promising because of the other consequences we see in a network structure. So the bottom panel of this left-hand graph here, what it's showing is two measures of network resilience. The first is the proportion of the original gamma, where gamma represents the parameter when you fit the degree distribution to power law. And so a higher value of gamma is essentially saying there's more centralization to a smaller number of vendors. And what this means is that as we increase the level of trust-based policing, what happens is more and more market shares are being directed to a relatively smaller proportion of distributors. And that makes the market more vulnerable to classic targeted attacks in the future. The right-hand panel is showing the decrease in assortativity, or the correlation between sellers and buyers' degree centralities. And this is a classic measure of network resilience. And essentially what we know, what happens is as assortativity decreases, the market gets more and more vulnerable to targeted attacks. So what this bottom panel is telling us is that not only is the proportion of sales decreasing as we ratchet up trust-based policing, the market is actually becoming more vulnerable to subsequent interventions. The right-hand panel is plotting the number of isolates, or in other words, the number of buyers who in the factual condition and our baseline simulations actually did purchase from the market, but in the increased interventions did not purchase from the market. And what we're seeing is as this trust-based policing ratchets up, even though we're getting kind of a more modest reduction in the total number of sales, we're getting an influx of people who select out of purchasing from the market who otherwise would have selected in. And so what we interpret these results to suggest is that actually our trust-based policing recommendations seem to have some important implications for how we might be able to slow market growth and even make markets more vulnerable to future interventions based on kind of classic supply-side policing. So one of the reasons that this paper was so influential in thinking about micro-macro analysis is that even though we were using an empirically grounded agent-based simulation, all of the outcome values we were examining were essentially implying a relationship between some selection mechanism at the micro level, why are buyers purchasing from specific vendors, and some outcome at the macro level. How many isolates are we observing? How many overall transactions are we observing? What does the degree distribution look like? And what does the degree-degree correlation look like as well? And so ideally, what we wanted to be able to do was not just simulate out the potential outcomes, but characterize what we might expect an effect size to be, and what that effect size might be subject to some uncertainty. And so what we really wanted to be able to do, or what we were hoping to be able to do, is actually create some type of statistical estimate. What is the change in the overall trafficking or the number of isolates we might expect given a shift in a selection mechanism? And how much uncertainty should we expect that to have? The second case where we started dealing with micro-macro problems is in a paper that came out in AJS a few years ago. And so the prior instance of, our prior case of darknet drug trafficking, we were focused primarily on policy. But we also were particularly concerned with what we thought was a very interesting theoretical puzzle posed by the darknet. And so if we go back to these kind of classic theories of how do markets operate in the absence of state oversight, theories of illegal markets and unregulated trade more generally consistently point to its network dependence. Basically, the idea here is that if I am an actor in an unregulated market, or a legal market, I need somebody to share information with me and provide me with some guarantees that my exchange partner won't rip me off. And so I'm looking for various trust signals and third-party referrals in order to establish that trustworthiness. Trust signals can range from anything, including kind of, do we share mutual contact? Do we share a family background? Are we from the same region? Do we have a shared ethnicity? And these various things that all kind of cue to a potential market actor that whoever I'm engaging in exchange with is somebody who is well-known and somebody I can trust. The problem we get in online settings, however, is that market actors are anonymous. I mean, the whole point of the darknet especially is to encrypt users' digital traces and purchasing histories. And so if successful, and it has largely been successful, we have limited information on all of these different types of trust signals that market actors have traditionally used. And because of this, prior work on online illegal drug trade, sorry, I'm getting glare from the morning sun over here, let me do this. Online illegal drug trade has really actually, and online trade more generally, has really actually suggested that networks might not matter in online trade settings. And the idea here is market actors are anonymous, so we can't actually import some pre-existing social network or interpersonal relationship into the trade relation. And the second point is that actually reputational information does a lot of really good work. Like basically everything we've seen about online trade has suggested that this reputational kind of mechanisms where people can formally evaluate trade records accrue history of successful trade actually fills in this concern about trust and is really successful, especially for attracting new buyers. But the problem we saw with this is that it is kind of essentially pushing it back a little. So if reputational information is providing a guarantee, how do market actors establish those reputations in the first place? And we were particularly concerned with this in the context of emerging markets. Because if we're thinking about this double riskiness, we have high information asymmetry from online settings, and we have high risk from illegality, then the early stages of market development are really, really critical for whether a market can actually get off the ground and become what Neil Fligstein calls a stable world, which is a market that is able to consistently distribute products and not simply something ephemeral. And so what we argued was actually, we think that networks play a critical role in developing reputational information in these early stage markets and promoting trade when other trust signals are absent. What we specifically argued is that we can actually think about economic trade structures as providing a trust signal, even in the absence of some pre-existing social network. And we focus on two mechanisms on the right-hand side of the panel here. So the first mechanism is a history of exchange. So if I purchased from you in the past, that alleviates a lot of this problem of information asymmetry and uncertainty that is inherent in trade relationships otherwise. If I know what you're going to be distributing, I have some sense of the product that you've already sold me, I have some sense of your professional etiquette, that alleviates my trust concerns. And indeed, this mechanism has been studied in the past and as a solution to uncertain trade in the context of social exchange, such as through Peter Kollick's work and Joel Polanyi's work. The second mechanism that we talked about is indirect referrals. And so usually when we're talking about a network referral on a market, it's been examined as a triad. Do we share a mutual contact? But in buyer-seller networks, referrals take a unique form, which is a four-cycle or a bow tie. And the idea here is that having a shared purchasing history with another buyer provides a type of trust signal because it suggests that the other buyer was willing to purchase from a new vendor because that new vendor sells products of a similar quality and has a similar etiquette as the already known or shared vendor. And so the indirect referral essentially fills in the role of the third-party referral that we've seen in past networks. So we tested these mechanisms using relational event models. And what we included was interactions between our measure of repeated trade, which is called sales inertia here, and our measure of four-cycle closure. And what this figure is showing you is the average marginal effect of each mechanism on the probability of exchange as time passes. And what we see is that in the early stage emerging markets, when no reputational information or little reputational information is present, the effect of sales inertia and four-cycle closure is actually quite strong. And if we do formal comparisons, it's actually stronger than the effect of reputations in the early stage markets. However, as markets develop and begin to kind of create a sense of generalized trust and have a critical mass of reputational information, we see the effect of each network mechanism actually start to attenuate, such that at the late stages of markets, four-cycle closure no longer matters, and sales inertia or histories of exchange actually has a negative effect on trade probabilities. And this sounds a little counterintuitive, but we're going to return to that result and discuss why it's the case a little bit later. The second thing that we examined is what effect does each of these network mechanisms have on reputation formation? And so this bottom panel here is showing the indirect effect of each network mechanism, repeated trade and four-cycle closure, over time by acting through reputations. And what it's showing is that about 30% of the effect of each network mechanism is contributing to the sales frequency because it's helping sellers build reputations. In other words, one of the mechanisms that sellers rely on in order to establish reputations in the early stage markets is network embeddedness. And so these results essentially make several interesting insights about the role of economic trade structures in facilitating trade, even in practically anonymous trade environments, and specifically how those networks matter the most in early stage emerging markets. So just like the case of policy intervention, one of the problems that we encounter here as it relates to micro-macro relationships is that many of the claims we want to make about outcomes of interest are actually features of the market as a whole. An implicit argument we're making is that if a network dependence, which is something happening at the micro-dyadic level, is driving long-term market stability, then what we would need to show is that there's some change in the aggregate market features, its level of efficiency, its level of kind of how long it stays in equilibrium, as a function of these early stage micro-level selection mechanisms. And so what we wanted to be able to do in an ideal sense is actually, again, come back to this effect estimate, or how do we actually show empirically and in a falsifiable sense that these selection processes are driving some feature of the market as a whole. So this brings me to the two papers that make up the heart of the methodological component of today's talk. We're going to start with the paper Micro Effects on Macro Structure in Social Networks. And then what we're going to do after we go through this, which this paper is in part innovation and in part synthesis of prior approaches. And then what we're going to do is move to a second paper that actually situates some of this micro-macro thinking in a mediation framework that tries to trace out indirect effects of selection mechanisms. So the idea of this micro effects on macro structure paper is how do we actually create a statistical estimate of some micro level selection mechanism on a function of network structure? And what I mean by function of network structure is that this method, or this framework, I should say, is intended for cases where we want to study some relational selection process and how it contributes to a feature of a network rather than a network as a whole. And so the idea is our dependent variable of interest might not actually be the network or whether two ties form or whether a tie forms, but rather a feature of the network, such as the level of transitivity, such as the mean degree centrality, such as the densities, such as network segregation, such as the number of communities. Essentially, anything we can calculate on a network might be the thing we're trying to explain rather than the network itself. And so there's a few ways we can think about this. In one case, and the case we'll come back to momentarily, is about how network embeddedness creates unique market structures. And so one way of thinking about it is that some types of network embeddedness, such as repeated trade, might contribute to monopolization and market fragmentation because people are depending on prior exchange partners to an excessive extent, and that's limiting competition. The other way of thinking about it is that for cycle closure or referrals might actually be driving integrated markets because switching between vendors through this type of trust signaling is actually creating more purchasing from a wider variety of vendors and therefore more competition. But beyond simply estimating the effects of distinct mechanisms on distinct structures, another advantage of this framework is we're able to disentangle the multiple mechanisms that could create the same structure. And so the example I'm not going to be talking about today in depth, but is in this paper, is the use of political segregation as a measure of political polarization. So it's increasingly common in political science to calculate political segregation on congressional networks and to show that political segregation has increased over time. And this result is usually interpreted as evidence of party polarization. But what I argue in the paper is that actually to reach this interpretation, it requires an assumption on the micro level mechanisms creating political segregation. Specifically, if political polarization is driving segregation, we should see choice-based preferences to collaborate or forge ties with members of the same party increase over time. And that increase in that effect should drive political segregation. But actually, there's a number of other possible mechanisms that could create political segregation in political networks. For example, in the US, the Republican Party is older, whiter, and mostly male as compared to the Democratic Party. And so preferential attachment, or same race, same sex, or similar age preferences to forge ties could actually create political segregation without any choice-based preferences for connection to same party members. At the same time, a lot of prior work in sociology has shown that things like reciprocity and triadic closure can create more segregated networks based on just small levels of initial segregation. So even in the absence... Yeah, sorry? Okay, so even in the absence of political homophily, we could see increases in political segregation simply as a function of either demographic homophily or selection on reciprocity and triadic closure. So the question is then, how do we actually parse out each of these potential micro-macro pathways? And so to do this, I'm going to build on some of the common simulation frameworks that have been used in the past and try to take them a little bit of a step further. And so what we're going to be doing is first we're going to write the network we observe as a function of some generative model. So A is used to denote the network we see, and then we write that network as some function of the selection process we want to study, denoted by X, and the confounding selection processes that offer alternative mechanisms that could generate the macro structure we want to examine. F is essentially just some arbitrary mapping function that represents that we could choose a very, very wide range of models to represent this relationship. So the network could be weighted, the network could be longitudinal, it could be multi-level, it could be cross-sectional. And so we could use an exponential random graph model, we could use a stochastic actor random model, relational event model, latent space model, whatever. If we can fit it into this idea where we have a network as a function, an additive, transformed additive function of some input conditions, we can essentially build into this framework. Now, the key here is we have two parameters, one being gamma and one being theta, representing the effect of each selection mechanism on the network as a whole. Now, keep in mind, these parameters are not actually telling us the effect on the structure we want to study. It's an effect on the network in its complete sense or in the dyadic sense of how likely is it two people will form connections. So based on this premise, what we can further do is write the macro structure we want to study as a function of the network we're observing. And so again, by macro structure, I mean anything that's calculated above the dyadic level. So it could be degree distribution, it could be between centrality, it could be mean distances, the power law scaling parameter segregation, whatever. And because it's a function of the network we observe, we can further write it as a function of the parameters and selection mechanisms that we included in our generative model. So for shorthand, we'll write M as a function of theta, X, gamma, and Z. So based on this, we can essentially say that there is some network that we observe, which is a function of the various input conditions we parameterize. In this example, it's triadic closure. But what we can also do is say that there's a counterfactual value of that network that we did not observe. And that's the network that we would see had some selection mechanism that we want to study, like triadic closure, not made any contribution. And so this gives us our counterfactual network, which is what would the network look like if triadic closure had absolutely no effect. So based on this, we can define a very generic estimand, which I call the micro effect on macro structure, or the MEMS, which is simply the difference between these two counterfactual conditions, or these two potential outcomes. One being, and the interpretation of it is simply what are the total contributions of our selection mechanism to the macro outcome that we want to study. Now, there are a number of desirable properties about this estimand. One of them is that it should be extremely familiar. And the reason is that this estimand has actually been implied in a lot of the simulation research that we've seen in the past. So kind of the work in ergom, especially on knockout experiments, which usually derives from Gary Robbins and Pitt Pattison's work on simulating from ergoms, is essentially an approach where what we do is we fit a model and we simulate a distribution of networks from that model, and then we flip some parameter off and simulate a second distribution. And then we kind of usually plot these distributions together and evaluate what the change is. So this has been an informal procedure, but what it's implying is the exact same estimand written here. And so we can think about the MEMS as simply representing the quantity implied in this vein of research. The estimand has also been implied in coevolution stochastic actor-oriented models, specifically with respect to evaluating or disentangling the contributions of peer influence and selection effects on the autocorrelation in behavioral attributes. And in this framework, what we do is typically we fit a coevolution Siena model, then we simulate a distribution of the autocorrelation parameter, and then see how much it changes when we flip the selection mechanism to 0 versus flip the influence mechanism to 0. And that gives us a sense of how much of the autocorrelation can be attributed to peer effects as opposed to selection. So the advantage of the MEMS, one of them, is that it's very familiar. It should be familiar to people because it's really formalizing the approaches that we've used in the past. But the second advantage is that because it's defined generally, regardless of functional form, that we can use the MEMS even in cases where we haven't had a background of using this type of simulation approach. And so that means that even in models like latent space models, generalized linear models when they're appropriate, such as the P2 or P1 model for dyadic dependent variables, or relational event models, dynamic network actor models, essentially any generative model for network structure, we can get the MEMS from it. And so even in these cases where we don't have as much of a research history on using the knockout experiment or simulating, we can use the MEMS generally for a very wide range of dependent network variables. The final thing that I think is really critical and potentially what I think is the most exciting innovation of this paper is that when we have a formal estimand, it actually allows us to come up with a standard error estimate for that estimand that permits hypothesis testing in a statistical framework. And so this allows us to move past the simulations that we've done in the past to start doing null hypothesis testing with micro effects on macro structure. And so the way we do this is we can actually just use a very generic type of what's sometimes called quasi-Bayesian estimation algorithm that's very widely used in computational statistics to estimate the MEMS. And the idea here is that what we're going to do is input some model that we've fit to the data using hat notation to indicate sample estimates. And then based on that model, what we're going to do is assume multivariate normality for the sampling distribution. And this assumption of multivariate normality, I'll say, actually can be relaxed because in some models we might not want to make it, or it might not be the best assumption, but we can switch with a different distribution if we want to. So we're going to assume that a multivariate normal distribution for the distribution of parameter estimates, and we're going to use the sample estimates as asymptotic approximates of the population parameters, and the covariance matrix of the estimator as the estimates of the, or asymptotic approximates of the population variances. Based on that, we're going to draw a very large number of samples of parameter estimates. And what this is doing is accounting for uncertainty in our parameter estimates when we're generating counterfactual networks. So rather than drawing a distribution of networks from a fixed set of sample estimates, now we're actually accounting for the standard errors around all our parameters in a generative estimated model. For each of those simulated parameter vectors, what we're going to do is draw two potential outcome networks, one from our best representation of the generative model, given some uncertainty, and one when we flip that selection mechanism off, or say it's at 0. Next, we're going to calculate the macro structure of interest that we want to examine on those potential outcome networks. And finally, we use that value to calculate the MEMS by either taking the difference or averaging over the difference if we have multiple values, such as in the case of degree centrality or between centrality or something as a dependent variable. That gives us one draw of the MEMS, subject to some level of uncertainty. We do that a very large number of times, 500, 1,000, 5,000, whatever have you, and that provides us our distribution of sampling estimates. From there, we can calculate the average MEMS as our point estimate for interpretation, but now we also get the variance estimate. And so we can take the standard deviation of that sampling distribution and treat it as the standard error if we want to assume normality. If we don't want to assume normality, we can take confidence intervals from the empirical distribution and calculate empirical p-values, all in order to conduct hypothesis testing on the micro-macro relation. So now what I'm going to talk through is an example of how I've applied the MEMS in recent research. So in this paper, as I've suggested before, one of the main problems that we encounter in thinking through legal markets is how market actors are able to engage in open competition. And specifically, what past research has argued is that high levels of network dependence in illegal markets actually causes illegal markets to be extremely uncompetitive. The idea being that we depend so heavily, or purchasers depend so heavily on the sellers that they purchased from in the past, that it prevents them from actually seeking out new distributors, which undermines market competition. So this draws on kind of the classic ideas of the paradox of embeddedness from Brian Utsi, which essentially argues that low levels of embeddedness create a competitive premium for market actors because, especially for sellers, because it allows them to establish return clientele and generate revenue. But at higher levels of network embeddedness, the social content of the trade relationship starts overriding economic incentives. Sellers become too dependent on prior clientele, which undermines their incentives for competition. They start cutting into profits because they're reducing prices by too much. And in the long run, this actually creates less competitive and less efficient markets. So what we're arguing in this paper is this really depends on how we're thinking about network embeddedness and the resulting macro structures. So on one hand, if we're thinking about embeddedness in a dyadic sense, where buyers are returning to the same sellers in order to purchase from them repeatedly, then this should, in theory, create a fragmented and relatively monopolistic market. But if we're thinking more about this referral mechanism or the four-cycle closure mechanism, then actually embeddedness is a route for buyers to purchase new goods from new vendors. And specifically, what we were focused on is the case of purchasing diversity and its relationship to product differentiation. And so what we're thinking here is that when we're engaging in a buyer-seller market, there is some amount of specialization within the goods buyers or sellers are distributing. And so when buyers are considering, okay, I purchased from you in the past, but now I want a good that you might not offer. At this point, I essentially have two options. One is I do not trust anybody else, and so I'm not going to seek out other vendors. The other option is I can try to assess the trustworthiness of a second vendor who's actually selling the goods I want to purchase. And so what we're arguing is that four-cycle closure actually facilitates the second pathway. It provides a trust signal, and it enables buyers to seek out new vendors to purchase from. So in the aggregate, each of these two network mechanisms should actually have asymmetric effects on competition or the number of unique vendors buyers are purchasing from. Repeated trade should depress the number of buyers or the number of sellers buyers are purchasing from, because they're returning to the same distributors for the same drugs. But indirect referrals should actually increase this number, or increase the number of vendors buyers are purchasing from, and make more competitive markets by providing a route to new good purchasing. So we tested this with relational event models, where we essentially interacted the new drug type purchasing, or the probability of a new drug type purchase, with each of their network variables. And what we showed was that the probability that somebody will purchase a new type of drug really sharply increases as 4-cycle closure increases as well, which is consistent with our idea that buyers are switching to new vendors to purchase new types of drugs. However, the probability that buyers will purchase a new type of drug slowly declines, and the probability that they will return to buy the same type of drug sharply increases as repeated trade or sales inertia increases as well. So at the micro level, this is consistent with the choice behavior that we're hypothesizing. Buyers are using 4 cycles to purchase new types of drugs and are less likely to purchase new types of drugs when they return to the same vendors. But what we wanted was that macro effect estimate. So we estimated the MEMS, treating the number of unique vendors buyers purchase from as the outcome variable. And so for 4-cycle closure, the MEMS was 0.411, and the mean number of vendors that a buyer purchased from was about 1.5. And so what this is telling us is that in the counterfactual condition where 4-cycle closure is not motivating buyers to purchase new types of drugs from new vendors, we would expect buyers to purchase from 0.411 fewer vendors. And this explains about 28% of the actual observed levels of average level of unique vendors that buyers purchase from that we observe in the data. The second MEMS here is for the repeated trade. And this is telling us that we would actually expect to see buyers purchasing from fewer unique vendors because of repeated trade. In other words, the MEMS is negative 0.49, and that's telling us that in the counterfactual world, where buyers do not return to prior exchange partners to purchase the same goods, we would expect to see about a 0.49 increase in the number of unique vendors that buyers purchase from. And this explains about 32% of the average level that we see in the data. And so what the micro effect on macrostructure is allowing us to do is actually directly estimate the effects of each of these selection mechanisms on the macrostructures of interest. And not only are we able to estimate them, but we're able to falsify against them. So rather than kind of saying that the micro-level selection mechanism is logically congruent with a macrostructure that we expect, we're able to actually start to falsify and quantify these effect sizes and compare between them to gauge what's going on. And here what we're finding is that actually, indeed, we see some asymmetry in the effects of network embeddedness, where certain types of embeddedness are making more competitive markets and other types of embeddedness are making less competitive markets. So the second paper, what we've talked about so far is kind of the classic way of thinking about micro-macro relationships and social networks, where we're trying to infer how a selection mechanism creates a unique network structure. But in the second paper, which is forthcoming at Sociological Methodology, I try to situate this thinking in an indirect effect or a mediation analysis framework. And the idea of a mediation analysis is that we can trace out the intervening variables that explain the effect of some causal mechanism on an outcome variable of interest. So if we're thinking about a structuralist perspective of social networks, we're often arguing that networks exert contextual effects on the individuals and groups nested in social networks. And so this could be something like if we're modeling school performance in adolescent high schools, your peers' GPA is likely to shape your own level of GPA, or your peers' educational attainment is likely to shape your own level of educational attainment. At the same time, when we're thinking about studies about generative network structure, we're often speculating on the micro-level mechanisms that are creating those very unique network structures that we're studying. So why is triadic closure contributing to some level of segregation in a network, which in turn is concentrating high GPA peers in some groups and not others? And so what this is implying is actually what I call an indirect selection effect, meaning that something happening at the relational level, students' tendencies to select friends based on their friends' friends, is actually shaping students' GPA because it's creating a more segregated network in terms of the GPA distribution. So when we start thinking about these indirect selection effects, we start seeing them all over the place in our theoretical reasoning. One of my favorite examples comes from Behrman, Moody, and Stovall's 2004 paper on adolescent romantic dating networks. And essentially what they're examining is what micro-level mechanisms create expansive chain-link structures in adolescent romantic networks. And they're arguing for four-cycle avoidance as a selection mechanism that creates this expansive chain-link structure. But the way they're justifying or motivating this analysis is by arguing that chain-link structures have really important implications for the distribution of sexually transmitted diseases within adolescent romantic networks. And so what is being implied here is that four-cycle avoidance, something happening at the micro level, has implications for population level disease spread and individual level disease risk, because that micro level selection mechanism is creating a unique network structure that has the expansive chain link structure. So the idea in this paper is to take this estimand, which is a theoretical quantity that we're often talking about, and try to develop tools in order to be able to actually define what it is, identify whether we can actually express it as a function of observable data, do so in a general framework, and finally develop generalized estimation procedures. So if we haven't talked much about indirect selection effects in past literature, it's not really surprising because they are a pain to actually estimate and think about. So this hairball of a directed acyclic graph is trying to outline all the causal pathways that we have to disentangle in order to identify an indirect selection effect. So the quantity of interest here is expressed as the AMME, which stands for average mediated micro effect. We're going to situate the mathematics in a potential outcomes framework, and we're going to borrow some of the language from the potential outcomes framework as well. And so T is going to be a selection mechanism of interest. This is something occurring at the dyadic level. If we're fitting a model for generative network structure, T is representing terms in those models. So it could be a triadic closure term, it could be a homophily term, it could be a sociality effect, what have you. M, again, is representing our macro structure of interest. So this is our intervening variable, or the network feature that we think of as a mediating mechanism. So in the prior example, this could be peer GPA. Now, however, what we have is Y, which is our outcome variable of interest. And by assumption in the AMME, Y is measured at a higher unit of analysis than T is operating. So Y is a node, group, or network level outcome variable. It could be student GPA, it could be group composition, it could be something about a school or a network as a whole. And so the indirect selection effect that we want to estimate is the effect of our selection mechanism T on Y because T changes the value of our macro network structure denoted by M. Everything else here is the stuff that we need to parse out in order to be able to identify this indirect effect. So one of the biggest problems we have in identifying it is that in classic mediation frameworks, we make two problematic assumptions. One is that we assume that all processes are measured at the same unit of analysis. So the classic approach to mediation analysis and the Sobel test, and it doesn't change too much in terms of the unit of analysis problem in more recent methods, is that we estimate two models to the same data set. One where the mediator is the outcome, and one where the outcome variable is the outcome, and we calculate the product of coefficients. The problem here is it assumes the coefficients can be comparable because the data are fit to, or the models are fit to the same sample. And because we're crossing levels of analysis here from the micro to the macro, and then from the macro to the unit, we're actually not able to meet this assumption and directly compare coefficients. The second problem is classic mediation approaches assume no post-treatment confounding. And what this means is that essentially we have some causal treatment intervention that changes a mediator and the mediator changes the outcome, but the treatment isn't changing anything else on an alternative causal path. We can rarely meet this assumption in networks because if we're switching a selection mechanism up or down by any given level, what we're actually doing is changing everything about the network because the network is interdependent. And so in order to actually identify this effect, we need to actually parse out not just the causal path through the mediator we want to study, but the confounding pathway through the other alternative mediators that might change as well. So in the case of, for instance, peer GPA contributing to student GPA, we might also hypothesize that switching a particular selection mechanism on or off might be shaping student school performance because it's increasing or decreasing degree centrality, or the overall number of friendships. It could also be increasing or decreasing transitivity, the local level of clustering that students are embedded in, which might alternatively shape GPA as well. And so what we're looking for here is we need to be able to define it in a way that can parse out the alternative causal pathways from the one we want to study. As in any kind of multivariable explanation, we also need to account for confounding variables, which are denoted by Z. these are the alternative selection processes that could explain the mediator or the pathway from the selection mechanism to the mediator that we need to condition on in order to get our indirect effect. And finally, the unique thing that we have in a micro-macro analysis is denoted by these dashed lines. And what these dashed lines represent is that sometimes we can have a direct effect, though we don't always. And the reason is that some selection mechanisms are truly dyadic. Something like triadic closure, this only exists on a relational level. But other selection mechanisms actually can have a direct effect on the outcome. And so we can have something like in school performance studies, we know that girls tend to have, on average, higher GPAs than boys. We also know from network analysis that girls tend to, on average, have more friends than boys. And so we can think of this as gender potentially having a direct effect on school performance, but also having an indirect selection effect because it's attracting more friendships in the first place. So to try to disentangle these pathways, we're going to, again, return to the potential outcomes framework. We're going to denote two potential values of our treatment with little script t. And what these values are going to be is ti of j representing the dyadic distribution of t that we see in the observed data, and 0 representing when we fix that value at 0. T of I of t is simply indicating what does the node level distribution of our selection mechanism look like in the observed data versus when it's fixed at 0. And in some cases, at a truly dyadic selection mechanism, T of I might not exist, but if it's a node level feature, it can. So for starters, we can denote two potential values of our selection mechanism, one being what does it look like in the data, and then one, what does it look like when it's switched off. Based on this, we can again denote two potential outcome values of our mediator. One being, what does the mediator look like under the observed distribution of our selection mechanism? And then one being, what does the mediator look like when our selection mechanism is held at 0? Now, at this point, we should actually feel pretty comfortable, because if we were to simply subtract the difference in these two mediator variables right now, we would get the MEMS. That's actually what we just defined and went through. But what we're going to do now is take it a step further to define potential outcomes at the unit level. So based on this expression, we can define 4 potential outcome values, which are mixtures of the factual and counterfactual conditions. The first is the complete factual condition expressed in the data, where we have our observed values of our selection mechanism, our observed values of our mediator, and our observed values of our post-treatment confounders. And this gives us our observed value of y. The second is what I call the complete counterfactual condition, which is what would the value of y look like if our selection mechanism were held at 0, our mediator obtained the value that would be expected if our selection mechanism were at 0, and our post-treatment confounders obtained a value when our selection mechanism was held at 0 as well. The next two potential outcomes are mixtures of the factual and counterfactual conditions. The first denoting what does our outcome look like at the unit level when our selection mechanism is held at 0, our post-treatment confounders obtain the value when our selection mechanism is held at 0, but our mediator obtains the value that's actually observed. And then the final potential outcome is what does the outcome variable look like when our selection mechanism obtains its observed value, our mediators obtain the value when our selection mechanism is at 0, but then our post-treatment confounders obtain their observed value as well. And based on this, we can define 2 unit-level indirect effects, which are simply the change in each of these conditions when we hold the post-treatment confounders and any direct effects constant while allowing the mediator to change. This gives us 2 definitions of the unit-level indirect effects. One, which is denoted by superscript m, which is the change in the unit level outcome when we switch a selection mechanism from off to on because of a change in the mediator. And the other denoted by superscript x, which is what is the change in the outcome we would expect when we switch a selection mechanism on and off because of a change in a post-treatment confounder. And so this allows us to disentangle not just the direct causal pathway for the mediator we want to study, but the alternative causal pathways as well. So at this stage, what we've gone through is the unit level definitions of these indirect effects, but the problem we encounter is that each of these expressions rely on potential outcome values that can never be observed. So we defined 4 potential outcomes, and only one of those is expressed in the data. And so the identification problem is, can we actually get the counterfactual values that we never observe directly from something observable, which is necessary to even use this method in the first place or estimate. And so I'm not going to go through the derivation, but we do have what I think is kind of a neat identification result that allows for post-treatment confounders. And the identification result is essentially illustrating that we can integrate over the difference in the distribution functions for the conditional distribution of our mediators given a focal value of t in order to get the mean level of the indirect effect. If that's a mouthful, or this expression, it takes a while to work through, and that's fine if it does. What the important takeaway message here is that we can actually express the average value or the point estimate we want for the indirect effect as a function of the observed data. And so even though we rely on potential outcome values that we cannot observe directly, the estimand that we want to draw inference on actually can be expressed of the data that we sample. So this provides the basis for the estimation algorithm, which is a very generic procedure that builds on the estimation I provided earlier. So now what we're going to do is simply incorporate some of these ideas into the micro effect on macro structure estimator by, again, using a kind of computational statistics approach. So we're going to input two models. Just as in the MEMS case, the first model is the model for the complete network as a dependent variable. It's a generative parametric model, so it could be an ergom, it could be an exponential random network model, it could be a Siena model, it could be a relational event model, dynamic actor network model, it could be a latent space model, whatever you're modeling network structure as a function of. The second model is the model for the effect of network structure on an outcome. This model is assumed to not be fit at the same unit of analysis as the first model. And this is the model where we have M representing some effect of network structure and X representing the alternative mediators. Based on this, we're going to assume multivariate normality for both models. Again, we can relax this assumption as needed, using the parameter estimates and the covariance matrices of the estimators as approximates of the population parameters and variances. Based on this, we define P to be an extremely large value. It could be 1,000, it could be 500, and we're drawing that many potential parameter values from the empirical distribution. For each set of parameter values, we're going to draw two potential outcome networks and draw two mediator values as well. Again, switching the treatment or the selection mechanism from on to off. At this point, we've done the exact same thing we've done with the MEMS. But now we're going to add some additional steps. What we're going to do next is also not just calculate the change in the mediator we're interested in, but also calculate the change in all the alternative mediators or post-treatment confounders that can be calculated on the network. So if we want to examine peer GPA, we're also going to calculate the post-treatment confounders, such as degree centrality, between centrality, whatever. Then we're going to plug in all the simulated values and combinations of the treatments and mediators and post-treatment confounders to our simulated model for the outcome variable and obtain our four potential outcome values for every single unit in the data. Based on this, we calculate our average value of the average mediated micro effect, and that gives us one single draw of the indirect selection effect of whatever selection mechanism we want to study on the outcome through a focal mediating variable. We do this a very large number of times, and that gives us an empirical distribution, which we can use to get percentile confidence intervals, standard deviations, and Monte Carlo p-values. Another nice thing about this algorithm is if we want to go in a non-parametric direction as well, we can provide non-parametric models by replacing the samples from a multivariate normal distribution with bootstrap draws. Okay, so the indirect selection effect is a very kind of abstract quantity, and it's one that we haven't dealt with a ton in the past. And so what I want to conclude by is talking about some ongoing work I have with my very smart collaborators, Dr. Maria Ouellette and Sadaf Hashimi at Georgia State University and University of Nebraska. And what we're applying this method to currently is to study the indirect selection effects of essentially friendship formation in policing networks on racial disparities and use of force. And so Marie and Sadaf have spent quite a few years collecting longitudinal data on police friendship networks within police departments and linking it to administrative data. And so one of the core problems that we see in kind of current policy arguments on racial disparities in policing is that kind of policy recommendations currently argue that officer diversification or more diverse departments would reduce disparities in policing. But one of the things that we haven't actually seen in the empirical literature is evidence that this relationship actually exists. Now, Linda Zhao at University of Chicago has argued that perhaps one reason why officer diversification doesn't seem to reduce racial disparities in policing is because we've been focusing on organizational diversification rather than segregation within police friendship networks. And so our idea here is, can we actually incorporate an indirect effect kind of framework to evaluate not only what is whether segregation in friendship networks is driving disparities in use of force, but also what's creating that segregation. So to do this, we focus on a Southeastern police department. And the department is kind of what we think of as an ideal case, because it's actually a majority-minority department. And so over 60% of the officers are Black, but over 90% of the victims of use of force are Black as well. So it's an instance where we actually have a classically diverse department, but also high levels of disparity in use of force. So to start, we first modeled our outcome variables, which is the frequency of each officer's use of force against Black victims versus white victims, as a network autocorrelation model with officer-level fixed effects. And what we found was that higher levels, or officers that had more white peers, tended to use force more frequently against Black suspects, but did not tend to use force more frequently against white suspects. We also saw that officers with more Black peers had no apparent relationship with use of force against Black victims or use of force against white victims. Finally, we also see that officers with more friendship connections, so higher degree centralities, use more force against Black victims, but do not appear to use more force against white victims. So this provides some evidence that there are network effects on racial disparities in use of force. And the next question is, what selection mechanisms are responsible for those network effects? So we captured this by fitting a generative network model using the temporal exponential random graph model. We have a bunch of controls listed at the bottom here. And we're focused specifically on two types of selection mechanisms, one being mutuality, or the tendency for officers to befriend other officers who befriended them, and the other being triadic closure, here denoted as GWESP, which stands for geometrically weighted edgewise shared partnership, which is simply a triadic closure parameter. And we found evidence of two indirect selection effects at work here. The first being the indirect effect of triadic closure operating through degree centrality. And so what we found was the average mediated microeffect is about 0.035. And so while that doesn't sound massive, we have to keep in mind that this is a heavily skewed distribution, where the mean use of force against Black victims is about 0.22 per officer, or only about 1 in 5 officers actually uses force against Black victims. And so here what we're seeing is that the causal pathway from triadic closure to use of force against Black victims can explain, through degree centrality, can explain about 15 to 16% of the mean level of use of force against Black victims that we actually see in the data. The indirect pathway through white peers is also explaining another 3.4%. So this suggests that triadic closure, officers' tendencies to befriend their friends' friends, is actually partly contributing to use of force against Black victims because it's increasing the number of white peers officers have. And between these two pathways, what we actually see is that triadic closure can account for about 20% of the observed level of use of force against Black victims that we see in the data. And so the indirect selection effect of triadic closure, or officers' tendencies to befriend their friends' friends, is actually quite strong because it's creating unique network structures that are conducive to racially disparate use of force. So I'm going to wrap up here in just a second, but what I really want to emphasize is I think these indirect selection effects are extremely interesting. I think they're a little harder to think about because we haven't had them in our vocabulary before, but I think they're extremely theoretically relevant and something that we've implied in a lot of prior research. Whenever we're arguing for the importance of a generative network model, we're typically assuming or implying that some network structure is relevant for explaining individual outcomes. And now we can actually estimate those relationships. But beyond a theoretical sense, I think they also give us more traction on policy interventions. So for example, if we were simply stopping short at this network autocorrelation model, we could have a policy intervention that is a little unsatisfying. It says something to the effect of we should have officers have fewer white friends, or we should have officers have fewer friends in the department as a whole. But by isolating the mechanisms that are actually kind of contributing to these problematic structures, we can get more tailored and deliberate policy interventions, such as, can we create socialization events that force officers to interact with people who might not be their friends' friends? Can we switch up patrols more frequently so officers have less exposure to their same friends' friends? All in efforts to kind of change what the network structure actually looks like. So thank you so much for your time. I'm really excited for the Q&A here. And if you are interested in playing around with the methods, they are implemented in the net mediate package, which is freely available on Crane. Thank you.